She sat behind a desk, worth more than his annual salary, looked him dead in the eye, and said something he'd never forget. "You're a single father, Damon. You should be grateful for what you have." 8 years, thousands of hours. Clients pulled back from the edge. And she used his daughter, his little girl, as a weapon against him. Brielle Langston didn't know. The man sitting across from her had already made his decision. Subscribe now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Hit that like button and don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about loyalty, power, and the price of underestimating the wrong person. The morning Damon Kessler turned 32, he didn't get a birthday cake. He got a conference call at 6:45 a.m. from a North Star Aerospace executive named Gerald Pritchard, who had the particular gift of being able to panic in complete sentences. "Quarterly figures don't line up, Damon. We're looking at a 38% gap between what your firm projected and what we're actually seeing. My board is asking questions I can't answer. I'm going to be honest with you, there are people in this building already talking to other firms." Damon was standing in his kitchen in a wrinkled button-down shirt, phone wedged between his shoulder and his ear, pouring cereal into a bowl for his 7-year-old daughter, Lila, who was sitting at the table in mismatched socks, still half asleep, drawing something on a paper napkin with a purple crayon. Damon said, keeping his voice level, "Give me today. Make any calls yet. Just give me today." There was a long pause on the other end. "One day, Damon, that's what I've got." He hung up, set the bowl in front of Lila, kissed the top of her head, and stood there for a second, looking at her. She had her mother's stubborn jaw in his eyes, dark brown, steady, the kind that didn't miss much. Her mother had been gone 4 years now. A car accident on a Tuesday in November, the kind of ordinary terrible thing that remakes your entire life in about 6 seconds. "You okay, Dad?" Lila asked, without looking up from her napkin drawing. "Bug, I'm okay. You've got your worry face on." "I always have my worry face on." "That's true," she said, completely serious, and went back to drawing. Sterling Crest Advisory occupied the top 3 floors of a glass building on Michigan Avenue that caught the afternoon light in a way the architects had clearly planned to be impressive. After 8 years, Damon barely noticed it anymore. He took the elevator to the 22nd floor, nodded to the receptionist, poured himself a coffee that was always slightly burned because nobody ever adjusted the machine settings, and sat down at a desk that was aggressively ordinary for a man who quietly kept the company from losing its most important relationships. Nameplate with a big title, no corner office, a desk, a monitor, a plant that was somehow still alive, despite Damon's complete indifference to watering it, and a phone that rang too often. His colleague Marcus appeared at the edge of his cubicle about 40 seconds after Damon sat down. Marcus was 39, wore the same 3 ties in rotation, and had an almost supernatural ability to appear exactly when something had gone wrong. "Heard about North Star," Marcus said, leaning against the partition. "Word travels fast. Klein was in early. He looked like somebody ran over his dog." Marcus lowered his voice. "How bad is it?" Damon looked at his screen, already pulling up 6 months of North Star account data. "Bad enough that Pritchard called me before 7 a.m. on my birthday." Marcus winced. "Happy birthday." "Thank you. You want me to—" "I've got it," Damon said, not unkindly. "Go keep Klein from doing something panicky." Marcus pointed at him. "You know he's going to take credit for whatever you fix." Damon didn't answer. They both already knew that. It wasn't a new conversation. What followed was not a single heroic afternoon. That's not how it actually works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What followed was 6 weeks that Damon would later describe to nobody in particular as the most grinding stretch of his professional life. He rebuilt the North Star relationship piece by piece, the way you'd fix a wall that had been damaged, not by one big impact, but by 100 small cracks that nobody bothered to fill until the whole thing started to lean. He spent the first week doing nothing but listening. He got on calls with North Star's internal team, the actual people who worked with Sterling Crest's reports every day, and he asked them simple questions. It's not working. What did we promise that we haven't delivered? Where do you feel ignored? People will tell you almost anything if you shut up long enough to let them. What he found was not a catastrophic failure. It was accumulation. Deliverables that were technically correct but practically useless. Reports formatted for Sterling Crest's internal presentation style, rather than for the way North Star's board seasons actually consumed information. Communication schedule that made sense on a spreadsheet, but created gaps of 3 and 4 weeks where North Star's team felt like they were operating blind. Small things, but small things are how trust erodes. He restructured the reporting format. He set up a bi-weekly 15-minute check-in, not a formal meeting with agendas and slide decks, just a call where someone from Sterling Crest picked up the phone and said, "Here's where things stand. What do you need from us?" He rewrote the language in 2 major deliverables that had been technically accurate, but had apparently confused at least 3 members of North Star's board into thinking the numbers were worse than they were. He worked late. He worked weekends. He hired a college student through a temp service to cover 2 Saturday mornings of childcare because his regular babysitter had a family commitment. And he felt guilty about it every single minute and made it up to Lila by letting her pick the movie 2 Fridays in a row, which meant he watched the same animated film about a dog who could talk 3 times in 14 days. By week 5, Gerald Pritchard's emails had stopped starting with "I need to be honest with you" and starting with "quick update." That was the shift Damon had been waiting for. When an anxious client stops framing every communication as a warning, you've crossed back over a line. By week 6, North Star signed the renewal. It wasn't just a renewal. It was an expanded contract, an 18-month commitment with 2 optional add-on modules that pushed the annual value up significantly. Damon sent a 2-line email to his direct supervisor, a senior manager named Tolliver, with the signed paperwork attached. He didn't make a production of it. He went home. Lila spaghetti with the jarred sauce she preferred over his homemade version, which she had informed him with complete honesty tastes like too much trying, and he sat at the kitchen table and finally felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The performance review meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 10. Damon wore the blue tie he kept for things that mattered. Had the documentation ready, not because he expected to need it, but because Damon Kessler was the kind of person who prepared for things even when he believed they would go fine. Old habit. Single-parent arithmetic. Assume nothing. Plan for everything. He'd been told the meeting was with Tolliver, which was standard. Reviews went through direct management. He'd done this 7 times before. It was usually a little awkward, mildly complimentary, and resulted in a handshake and a compensation letter. When he got to the conference room, Tolliver was there. But so was Brielle Langston. Damon had been in rooms with Brielle before. Often. She operated at a different altitude, the kind of CEO, who had an assistant whose primary job seemed to be making sure she was never inconvenienced by the ordinary mechanics of her own company. She was 30 years old, had inherited a significant portion of Sterling Crest from her father, had a business degree from Wharton, and had spent the 3 years since taking over as CEO making it very clear that the company's direction was hers to set and nobody else's. She was also, by any honest accounting, sharp. Not the sharpest person Damon had ever encountered, but smart enough to be genuinely dangerous when she decided she didn't like you. Damon hadn't thought she'd formed a strong opinion about him, either way. He sat down. Tolliver did most of the talking at first, the standard language about strong performance, commitment to client retention, valuable contribution to the firm's quarterly outcomes. Damon listened and waited for the number. Brielle slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Damon looked at it. The number was 43% lower than what he had expected. What he had, by his read of the performance bonus structure in his contract, actually earned. He sat with it for a moment, kept his face neutral. Then he looked up. "Can you walk me through the calculation?" he said. "'Cause Based on my understanding of the bonus structure, this doesn't match the performance metrics. Tolliver glanced at Brielle. Brielle looked at Damon with the particular patience of someone who has already decided the conversation is over. The firm had to make some allocation adjustments this quarter, she said. The bonus pool is redistributed based on broader organizational priorities, not just individual account performance. My contract specifies performance-based compensation tied to client retention and revenue outcomes, Damon said. He wasn't raising his voice. He was just saying the words clearly, which he'd noticed, sometimes the same effect on people as raising your voice. The North Star renewal alone pushed us past the quarterly revenue target. We appreciate that, Damon. The way she said appreciate made it sound like something you'd say to a child who'd drawn you a picture. Your work on North Star was valuable. But as I said, the pool allocations. How was the pool allocated? A brief silence. That's not information I'm in a position to share at this level, Brielle said. Damon nodded slowly. He looked down at the paper once more. Just want to make sure I understand, he said. I saved a multi-million-dollar account, pushed the company past its quarterly target, and the result is that my bonus is cut by nearly half. The result, Brielle said, and there was something in her voice that had sharpened slightly, is that you have a stable, compensated position with a firm that has supported your ability to maintain a work-life balance as a single parent. That kind of security isn't nothing, Damon. He looked at her. She continued, and her tone was not cruel exactly, but it was deliberate. Encourage you to think carefully about what you have here. Job security, a consistent schedule, a company that's worked with your family situation. Those things matter, especially for someone in your position. There it was. He'd heard versions of it before, in smaller ways, from different people. The assumption that because he had Lila, because he was doing it alone, he was somehow tethered. A man with a child and no partner to split the load with would always choose the safe option. Would always absorb what was given to him because the alternative was too frightening. She wasn't wrong that security mattered to him. It did. Enormously. Lila's school, her routine, the mortgage on the house they'd moved into 2 years after her mother died. Because Damon had needed her to have a yard, all of it required a steady paycheck. He was not someone who took risks casually, but there is a difference between a man who is cautious and a man who is afraid. Brielle Langston, 30 years old, is extraordinarily wealthy, apparently very certain she understood Damon Kessler's inner life had confused the two. I'd encourage you, she added, her voice settling into something that could pass for gentle, if you didn't listen closely, not to mistake being useful for being irreplaceable. The room was quiet. Damon picked up the paper, folded it once along the crease, and put it inside the pocket of his jacket. He looked at Tolliver, who had been studying the table surface with intense concentration for the last several minutes, and then he looked at Brielle. I appreciate your time, he said. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the elevator. He didn't call Miles Carradine from the elevator. He wasn't that dramatic about it, and Damon had never been the kind of person who made major decisions while his blood was still running hot. Called from his car, he parked in the building's underground garage, engine off, sitting in the specific gray silence of a concrete parking structure at 10:40 in the morning. Miles Carradine picked up on the second ring. Damon. His voice was easy, the voice of a man who'd been waiting for this call without being willing to admit he'd been waiting for it. What can I do for you? 6 months ago you offered me a position, Damon said. Is it still available? A brief pause. Not hesitation, calculation. Miles Carradine was many things, but he wasn't the kind of man who let sentimentality get the way of a good business decision, which was probably why Carradine Holt Partners had spent the last 4 years quietly eating into Sterling Crest's market position. The VP of Strategic Accounts role is still structured the way I described it, Miles said. Title, team, 35% over your current base, guaranteed quarterly bonuses tied to account performance. I may need to have a conversation with our CFO about the specifics, given the time that's passed. But the fundamentals are intact. Want to review the offer formally before I give you an answer? I'd expect nothing less. I'll have my assistant reach out to set something up. This week? This week works, Damon said. He sat in the car for another few minutes after hanging up. Second-guessing, he'd done his second-guessing privately over the previous months, turned the question over 100 times in the particular way that people who make decisions alone tend to do. He thought about Lila. He always thought about Lila. The thing Brielle didn't understand, the thing most people who'd never had to do it alone didn't understand, was that providing for a child didn't just mean collecting a paycheck from whoever was currently willing to hand one over. Building something stable enough to last. It meant not letting yourself be slowly ground down by an employer who'd learned they could cut what you were owed because they decided you were too scared to leave. Staying wasn't the safe choice. Staying in that room under those terms with that woman running the numbers staying was what was actually dangerous. He drove home. He changed his tie, picked Lila up from school at 3:15, and took her to the taco place on Elmwood she'd been asking about for 2 weeks. She ordered 3 tacos and ate 1.5 and talked for 40 minutes about a disagreement she'd had with her best mitzvahfritzpity over the rules of a game they'd apparently invented themselves. And Damon listened to the whole thing and asked questions in the right places, and did not think about Brielle Langston at all. He met with Cara Holt's legal team on a Tuesday. He reviewed the offer with the attorney he'd used for his mortgage, not a corporate lawyer, just a careful woman named Sandra who read documents very slowly and asked precise questions that turned out to matter. She found 2 clauses worth renegotiating. Cara Holt agreed to both without significant pushback. Damon signed on a Wednesday evening at Sandra's office with a pen she offered him that had clearly been used by a lot of people, signing a lot of documents. He sat with the signed papers for a moment. "You good?" Sandra asked. He said, "I think I am." He wasn't performing confidence. He was just describing the interior weather, which had been a particular kind of stormy for about 6 months and had gone unexpectedly quiet. He drafted his resignation that night after Lila went to bed. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a legal pad and wrote 3 versions of it. The first was too cold. The second was too explanatory, the kind of letter that tries to make a point and ends up just making the person writing it look like they couldn't let go. The third was professional, brief, and said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. He attached a transition plan, a real one, not the bare minimum that the company policy required, a thorough document that mapped out every active client relationship he was involved with, every communication rhythm, every relevant piece of context that whoever came after him would need to have even a reasonable shot at maintaining what he'd built. Marcus, when he found out about it later, shook his head. Spent how many hours on that transition plan? Damon, she cut your bonus. You didn't owe them a detailed handoff. Damon said. So why? Because the clients did nothing wrong. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then nodded. There wasn't much to say to that. He submitted the resignation on a Thursday morning the same day of the week as the review meeting, which was not intentional, but which he noticed. Tolliver's response came within a minute. 3 sentences, professionally worded, acknowledging receipt and noting they'd be in touch regarding the transition process. Brielle's response came 4 hours later through her assistant, requesting a meeting. She was at her desk this time, the real desk, in her actual office. The one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlook Michigan Avenue and a credenza that held a collection of tasteful objects that Damon had always suspected were more about the image of a person who appreciated tasteful objects than about any genuine attachment to the objects themselves. She offered him coffee. He declined. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she started. What specifically? Damon asked. She shifted. Just slightly. About the compensation decision. I want you to know that your work on North Star was genuinely valued. The allocation adjustments this quarter where the board was involved Brielle. Yes. He said her name calmly, the way you'd say it if you were trying to steer a conversation that was drifting. I'm not here to renegotiate. I've signed an offer. I've submitted my resignation. I'm here because your assistant asked me to come, and I thought it was the professional thing to do. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not quite discomfort, but an adjacent thing. What would it take? She said. What do you mean? To stay. What would it take? He thought about the honest answer to that question, which was complicated enough that he didn't fully trust himself to explain it in a way that would actually land. So he settled for the simple version. It would take going back in time to a conversation that already happened, he said, and having it go differently. Brielle held his gaze. You're really going to walk away? Over a bonus. I'm walking away, Damon said, because of what that conversation told me about how this company sees me. The number was the information. It wasn't the problem. She tried 3 more times before he stood up. She mentioned security twice. She mentioned Lila once, not cruelly, but deliberately. The way you'd play a card you believed was still in your hand. She offered a revised compensation structure. That was, he had to give her credit, meaningfully better than what she'd handed him 10 days earlier. None of it moved him. Not because he was performing resilience, he genuinely wasn't, but because the decision had been made in a parking garage 10 days ago, and he'd had 10 days to confirm it. Thing about decisions you've had time to sit with is that they tend to get harder to unmake, not easier. I wish Sterling Crest well, he said, standing up and buttoning his jacket in exactly the same motion as the last time he'd been in a meeting that ended this way. I mean that. He walked toward the door. You think Carradine is going to be different? She said behind him. He could hear something in her voice that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite disbelief. You think they're not just using you the same way? He stopped, not because the question hurt it didn't, but because it was actually a fair question, and fair questions deserved a moment. Maybe, he said without turning around, but I'll find that out. And if they do, I'll make a different decision then. He walked out. She put her hand flat on her desk after the door closed and sat very still for a moment. His last day was a Friday. Grocery monded. Marcus brought a grocery store cake the kind, with white frosting and a slightly crooked inscription, and approximately 9 people crowded into the small kitchen area for an awkward 20 minutes in which everyone said nice things and nobody quite made eye contact. Damon ate a slice of cake. He thanked people individually. He shook Tolliver's hand and meant it. Tolliver had always been decent to him within the limits of what Tolliver was willing to risk, which were modest limits, but still. He cleaned out his desk, which took less time than he expected, because he'd never accumulated much. A framed photo of Lila from 2 Christmases ago, a coffee mug. 3 pens that were actually his, a small cactus that Marcus claimed immediately and without asking, which Damon appreciated, because he'd been mildly worried about what to do with it. He rode the elevator down. In the lobby, he stood for a moment in the particular slant of afternoon light that came through the building's front glass around 4 p.m., the kind of light that makes ordinary spaces look briefly like they mean something. He thought about 8 years, not regretfully more like accounting. What you put in, what you got back, what the ledger actually looked like when you added it up honestly. He walked out. Outside, the air was cold in the sharp-edged way of Chicago in early spring, when the weather hasn't decided yet and keeps changing its mind. He turned up the vent, his collar, put his hands in his pockets, and walked toward the parking structure without looking back at the building. It was not a man walking toward something perfect. It was a man walking toward something better. And for someone who'd learned to be realistic about what better actually looked like, that was enough. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. A text from Lila. Dad, did you forget it's Pizza Friday? He stopped on the sidewalk and looked at the message and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was still wound. He typed back, I did not forget. Be there in 40 minutes. 3 seconds later, a response, okay. Extra cheese? Extra cheese, he typed. He put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking. The weekend after his last day at Sterling Crest, Damon did something he almost never did. He slept in, Not deeply, he hadn't slept deeply since before Lila was born, and single parenthood had rewired his brain to surface at the smallest sounds, a habit that 7 years later still hadn't let go. But when his eyes opened at 6:40 on Saturday morning, and he lay there listening to the apartment and hearing nothing but Lila's small snore from down the hall and the radiator ticking and a car moving. Slowly down the wet street outside, he didn't get up. He just lay there with his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling and let the quiet be what it was. He started at Carradine Holt Partners the following Monday. The office was on the 27th floor of a building 4 blocks north of Sterling Crest, which was either an irony or a coincidence, depending on how you felt about such things. And Damon had decided before his first commute that he was going to feel nothing in particular about it. Chicago was a city of tall buildings and financial firms, and men in good coats walking between them. Geography was not meaning. Miles Carradine met him in the lobby himself, which Damon had not expected. Miles was 51, built like someone who had played college football 30 years ago and kept most of it, with gray at his temples and the particular ease of a man who'd made his money through a combination of genuine talent and a willingness to absorb risks that scared other people. He had a handshake that meant something not performative, just solid, and he looked at you when he talked to you in a way that felt less like attention and more like assessment, which Damon respected more than the alternative. "Welcome," Miles said, and gestured toward the elevator, without ceremony. The ride-up was quiet. Miles had a coffee in his hand and offered Damon nothing, which Damon appreciated, because it suggested Miles understood that people who were starting new things generally didn't need hospitality. They needed information. "Your team is 4 people right now," Miles said as the elevator moved. 2 senior account managers, 1 analyst, 1 coordinator. The analyst is solid. The coordinator is still learning. The senior account managers, he paused, choosing his words. They're capable, but they've been operating without direction for about 3 months, since the person running strategic accounts left. Things have drifted. How badly? Nothing catastrophic. Some communication gaps with clients. Deliverable timelines that have slipped more than they should. A general sense that nobody's quite sure what the standard is yet. Miles glanced at him. The accounts are intact. I want to be clear about that. I'm not handing you a disaster, but they need attention, and they need someone who can set a tone. Damon nodded. I'll need a week or 2 to assess before I start changing anything. That's exactly right, Miles said. Don't fix what you don't understand yet. The elevator opened. Damon followed Miles out into an office that was, in its physical arrangement, not dramatically different from Sterling Crest. Desks, monitors, the smell of coffee and carpet and recirculated air. People glanced up, registered that Miles was walking with someone they didn't know, and returned to their screens with the particular practiced casualness of people, pretending not to be curious. Miles stopped in front of a glass-walled office that was, by a meaningful margin, larger than any workspace Damon had occupied in the last 8 years. This is yours, Miles said. Damon looked at it. A desk, 2 chairs for meetings, a window that faced north, whiteboard along one wall. Nothing on the surfaces yet. His name was already on the door, in the kind of clean santh font that meant someone had anticipated his arrival enough to get the sign made in advance. He stood there for a second longer than he intended. Miles asked. No, Damon said, just adjusting. Miles made a sound that might have been a laugh. Come find me when you're done adjusting. I'll introduce you to your team. His team. Damon stepped into the office, set his bag down on the desk, and stood at the window looking north over the city. The lake was visible in the middle distance, gray-green under the overcast March sky. He could see, if he angled slightly, the top of the building he'd left 4 days ago. He turned away from the window and got to work. The 4 members of his team were gathered in a conference room when Miles brought him in 30 minutes later. They stood up with the slightly awkward energy of people who weren't sure what the correct response was to someone new walking into their professional lives with authority over them. The 2 senior account managers were Janet, who was 44 and had the watchful quality of someone who'd survived enough management changes to have stopped forming opinions prematurely, Ruben, who was 36 and had the specific restless energy of someone good at their job, who'd been underutilized for too long. The analyst, a 26-year-old named Priya, had a yellow legal pad already open and a pen in her hand. Coordinator, Owen, who was 23 and looked approximately 19, was trying very hard not to look nervous and failing quietly. Damon looked at them. He hadn't prepared a speech and didn't intend to give one. "I'm not going to tell you how I operate for the next couple of weeks," he said. "I'm going to watch how you operate. Then I'll have something useful to say. What I can tell you now is that I'm not here to overhaul everything from day one. I'm not going to schedule meetings that should be emails. We'll tell you when something isn't working instead of writing it down somewhere you never see." He paused. "I also need good coffee. If anyone knows where the decent stuff is in this building, that information is valuable to me." Ruben pointed at Priya. "She brings her own beans." Priya looked mildly alarmed at being identified. "I'll be talking to each of you individually this week," Damon said, "just to understand where things actually are. Not a performance review. Just a conversation." He looked around the table. "Any immediate questions before we get back to actual work?" Janet spoke. "Are you planning to make changes to account assignments?" "Until I understand the accounts." "Okay," she said. Posture relaxed about 2 degrees. That was enough. Owen raised his hand slightly, the way someone does when they know raising your hand is technically not what you do in a professional meeting, but the instinct hasn't fully died yet. "Should we call you?" "Damon," Damon said. Owen nodded as if this answer had solved something significant. Caught Damon's eye from the doorway where he'd been standing, gave a small nod that communicated approval without making a production of it, and left. The meeting broke up. People went back to their desks. Damon went to his office, sat down, and opened the account files that had been shared with him the previous week. He had a lot of reading to do. He read until 1 in the afternoon without stopping, making notes on a legal pad in the shorthand he'd developed over 8 years, not because he'd been taught it, but because he'd needed to process large amounts of information quickly, and his brain had eventually organized itself around the necessity. By 1, he had a preliminary picture of 12 active accounts, relative health, the gaps in each relationship. 3, that needed attention within the next 30 days. He texted Lila, "How was school?" Her response came 12 minutes later, "Fine. We learned about volcanoes. Can we get a volcano science kit?" "We can look at one," he texted back, which he'd learned was the correct parental language for probably, "but let me see how much it costs." "Yai," she sent, which told him she'd already interpreted it as a yes. He smiled at his phone, set it face down on the desk, and went back to reading. He found Priya's coffee beans on Wednesday morning. She kept them in her desk drawer. She'd told him, because the communal kitchen was, in her words, a lawless space where good coffee cannot survive. She showed him how to use the pour-over setup she'd established in the small secondary kitchen near the copy room, which apparently only she and 2 other people knew existed. Damon stood next to her while she walked him through it, and they talked about the Meridian account, one of the 3 he'd flagged, while the coffee dripped. And Priya had good instincts about the gaps, and wasn't afraid to say so, which was a quality he valued more than most things in a junior colleague. "Communication lag is the main problem," she said, pouring. "Meridian's team sends questions, we respond in 3 or 4 days. They've already made decisions by the time we answer. They're frustrated that we're out of sync. Who sets the response timeline?" Priya looked at him. There wasn't a clear standard after James left. Janet has been trying to manage it, but she's also handling 2 other accounts at full capacity. "Okay," Damon said. He didn't say it like he was dismissing her. He said it like he was filing it, which was actually what he was doing. He took his coffee and went back to his office and spent 45 minutes drafting a clear response time protocol for his team, not a long document, 3 pages, specific and unambiguous, and sent it to all 4 of them before noon with a note that said, "Let me know if anything here is unworkable from where you're sitting. I'd rather adjust it now than watch it fail later." Janet replied within the hour, with 2 suggested modifications that were he had to admit improvements on his initial draft. He incorporated both and sent the revised version. This was how the first month went. Quietly, incrementally, without drama. Damon set standards through behavior, more than through announcements. Yes, intervened. He responded to emails within windows he'd established for his team, which meant they could see what it looked like in practice. He sat in on client calls before taking them, learning the relationships before imposing himself on them. He asked questions in internal meetings and then didn't speak again until he had something specific to add, which was, apparently, unusual enough that Ruben commented on it at the end of the 3rd week. They were at Ruben's desk at 6:15. On a Thursday evening, the office mostly empty, just the 2 of them working through the structure of a client presentation, due the following Tuesday when Ruben leaned back in his chair and said, out of nowhere, "You're different than I expected." Damon looked up from the document. "How so?" "I don't know. From what I heard, coming in, Miles talked you up pretty significantly. I expected someone who'd be in here throwing weight around, making a lot of noise about how things were going to change. Things are changing. Yeah, but..." Ruben searched for the word. Quietly, like we don't notice until it's already different. Damon thought about that. Announcing change and making change aren't the same thing, he said, and went back to the document. Ruben was quiet for a moment. Then, "Where'd you work before here?" Miles wouldn't say specifically. "Sterling Crest." Ruben raised his eyebrows. "Sterling Crest is a good firm." "It is. Why'd you leave?" Damon looked at him. It was a fair question, the kind that deserved some form of honest answer, even if not a complete one. "The company's view of my value and my view of my value had a disagreement," he said. It didn't resolve. Ruben sighed slowly, with the recognition of someone who'd had their own version of that conversation somewhere along the way. "Fair enough," he said, and went back to work. Back at Sterling Crest, things were not quiet. Damon knew this not because he was monitoring the situation, he wasn't, and made a specific point not to be, but because Marcus texted him 3 times in the first month, and Marcus was not a person who texted without reason. The first text, 2 weeks after Damon left, was brief. "This Tolliver is managing your accounts directly. It is not going well." The second, a week later, North Star asked for a meeting and sent 3 people. Tolliver sent one. You can imagine how that went. The third, at the end of the month, was longer. "Look, I'm not trying to pull you into anything. I just want you to know that the narrative in here right now is that you took proprietary client knowledge when you left. I don't think anyone actually believes it, but someone is saying it. Wanted you to hear it from me first." Damon read the third text twice. Then he put his phone in his desk drawer, closed the drawer, and sat for a moment with the very specific anger of a person who has been accused of something they didn't do and can't immediately respond to. No. He'd left behind a transition plan so detailed it had taken him 4 hours to write. He'd downloaded nothing. He'd contacted no Sterling Crest clients after leaving, not to solicit business, not even socially, because he'd been careful specifically because he'd known there was a chance something like this could happen. He had 8 years of professional conduct on his side, and not a single document, email, or communication that could be misread. He called Sandra. "Someone's claiming I took proprietary client information when I left Sterling Crest's," he said when she picked up. "Who specifically?" "I don't have a name yet. Internal rumor so far." "Has anything formal come to you?" "Letter, email, legal notice." "Then right now it's noise," Sandra said. "But document everything. Write down what you know, what you didn't do. Put a date on it. If it escalates to something formal, I want you to have a contemporaneous record." "Already doing it," he said, because he was. "You doing okay otherwise?" He thought about Ruben's comment about quiet change, Priya's coffee, about Owen, who had started anticipating needs before being asked, and was going to be genuinely good at this job in about 2 years. About Lila, who had received the volcano science kit last weekend and had spent Saturday afternoon covering the kitchen table and approximately 30% of the kitchen floor in baking soda and red food coloring, and had been the happiest he'd seen her in months. He said, "I'm okay." "Good," Sandra said. "Call me when something formal comes through. And Damon, don't reach out to anyone at Sterling Crest about this." "It's it. I know. I mean it. Don't send any emails that could be read as defensive. Don't." Sandra, I know. She made the sound of a lawyer who'd said the necessary thing and was now satisfied. "All right, call me." The formal letter arrived 9 days later. Came from Sterling Crest's legal department. 3 paragraphs of dense language that amounted to an accusation that Damon had, in the course of his final weeks at the firm, accessed and copied client relationship data for the purpose of using it to benefit a competitor. The letter didn't make a specific legal claim yet. It was, in Sandra's words when he sent her a photograph of it, a shot across the bow they're seeing if you panic. He didn't panic. He and Sandra prepared a response that was thorough, documented, yes, and completely calm. It laid out the timeline of his access to Sterling Crest systems, that all his activity had been standard and job appropriate, attached a copy of the transition plan he'd left behind, and invited Sterling Crest's legal team to review whatever access logs they had, because he was confident what those logs would show. What they showed Damon Crest eventually conducted the review their letter had implicitly promised, was exactly what Damon had said they would show. He found out the investigation had concluded through Miles, who called him into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and closed the door, which Miles rarely did. "I'm going to tell you something." Miles said, sitting down across from him, "and I want you to know that I'm telling you because you deserve to know, because it changes anything on our end." Okay, Sterling Crest's legal team has confirmed internally that their investigation found no basis for their initial accusation. "I have a contact at the firm, not a spy, just someone I've known for 15 years, who tells me things when he thinks I should know them." Miles looked at him steadily. "They're not pursuing it further. There won't be any formal action." Damon sat with that for a moment. "How long did you know there was an investigation?" he asked. "Since about a week after the letter reached you. You didn't say anything, you were handling it. Sandra's competent. And I didn't think you needed me to pile on by treating it like a crisis." Miles paused. "Was I wrong?" Damon thought about it honestly. "No," he said. "You weren't wrong." Miles nodded. "The accusation came from Brielle," he said. "From the legal department on their own. I want you to know that, because I think you probably already suspected it, and I'd rather you hear it plainly than assume it. He had suspected it. He didn't say so. She made a mistake," Miles said, and the way he said it wasn't triumphant. It was the same tone someone would use to describe a weather pattern. A thing that happened. And now she's dealing with the consequences of that mistake, which doesn't require anything from you. Damon agreed. "It doesn't." Miles uncapped his pen, a habit Damon had noticed that he did when he was transitioning topics. "The Hartwell account. Your assessment?" And just like that, they were back to work. Which was exactly right. The months that followed had a texture to them that Damon would have struggled to describe to someone who hadn't lived something similar. Exciting, not dramatic, but different from before in a way that compounded quietly, the way interest does. He had authority that matched his actual responsibilities. Yes, he'd intervened. When he made a recommendation about an account, it was implemented, or it was discussed. It was not ignored or filtered through 3 layers of people protecting themselves. When he needed a resource for a client, he requested it and generally received an answer within 48 hours, rather than watching the request disappear into some bureaucratic current. When he put his name on something, it meant something, because the title on his door was not decorative. He was still working hard. It wasn't easier in the sense of requiring less effort. If anything, he was doing more, because more was expected and he was capable of more. But effort expended in a place that used it was not the same as effort expended in a place that extracted it. The first kind tired him in a way that sleep could fix. The second kind had been doing something else to him, slowly, for 8 years, and he'd been so close to it that he hadn't fully felt it until it stopped. He got home most nights in time for dinner. Not every night there were late ones. A few very late ones during a particularly difficult stretch in June when two accounts needed simultaneous attention, but most nights. He made la spaghetti that she still found too complicated and grilled cheese that she deemed acceptable and homemade pizza on Fridays that she had decided was her favorite thing, a ranking he intended to maintain as long as possible. She turned 8 in April. He threw her a birthday party in their backyard with 6 of her friends, a rented inflatable slide that cost more than he was comfortable admitting, and a cake from the bakery on Clifton that she had specified in writing literally, written list, which she had presented to him with complete seriousness 2 weeks before the party, should have the purple frosting. The pink. Those are different, Dad. Cake had purple frosting. He stood at the edge of the yard, watching her on the slide with her friends, laughing at something with her head thrown back the way she did, when something was genuinely funny to her rather than just socially funny. And he felt the kind of tired that was actually contentment, if you looked at it right. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it without thinking. A number he didn't recognize, but the area code was downtown. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from a North Star Aerospace executive named Carolyn Vance, who identified herself as the head of their Strategic Partnerships division. She said she was reaching out on behalf of North Star's leadership team. Yet, she said they'd been reassessing their advisory relationships. She said she wanted to schedule a conversation when he had availability. She did not mention Sterling Crest by name. She didn't need to. Yes, demeaned. Damon stood at the edge of his daughter's birthday party and listened to the message twice, then put his phone in his pocket and walked back toward the yard. Later that night, after Lila was in bed and the yard was mostly cleaned up, 6 8-year-olds generated a particular kind of debris field that required real logistical effort. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and thought about the message. He'd done nothing to solicit North Star's attention. He hadn't reached out to them, hadn't mentioned them to anyone at Carradine Holt, hadn't even let himself think about that relationship as an available asset because it wasn't his to use. He'd built the relationship while working for Sterling Crest with Sterling Crest resources, and his personal integrity on the subject was more important to him than any account value. North Star calling him wasn't the same as him reaching out to North Star. He hadn't created that situation. He'd just been the person whose work North Star apparently still thought about when they were reconsidering their options. In the morning, he called Miles before doing anything else. Star reached out to me directly, he said. A Carolyn Vance, head of strategic partnerships. A brief silence on Miles's end. Prize calculation. When? Yesterday. Voicemail. Have you called her back? I called you first. He could hear Miles processing. You did the right thing calling me first. This is a significant opportunity, but it's sensitive. You have a prior relationship with that account that came through Sterling Crest. We need to be clean about how this proceeds.
I know.
I won't reach back without your legal team reviewing the situation. Another pause. Carolyn Vance is a serious player over there. If she's calling you personally, they've already had internal discussions. This isn't exploratory. That's what I figured. Miles was quiet for a moment. Get me the details of what you know about their current situation with Sterling Crest. Whatever's public, whatever you can characterize, without using anything proprietary. I'll have legal look at how we proceed. There's one more thing, Damon said. What? I want to be transparent about this with you in both directions. If at any point the way this develops puts me in a position that feels wrong, that uses anything from my time at Sterling Crest in a way I'm not comfortable with, I'm going to tell you. And we're going to find a different path. The line was quiet for long enough that Damon wondered if the call had dropped. Then Miles said, "That's exactly why I hired you," and hung up. Sat at his desk for a moment after that, in the morning quiet, before his team arrived, looking at the north-facing window and the city beyond it. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Marcus. Just so you know, North Star is coming in for a meeting with Brielle next week. Word is it's not going well. Thought you should have the context. He didn't respond. He put the phone in his drawer, opened his laptop, and began preparing the summary Miles had asked for. Whatever was coming, he was going to be ready for it. That was the thing about Damon Kessler. Not that he was always 2 steps ahead, not that he never made mistakes, not that his life was running cleanly and smoothly towards some predetermined good outcome. He wasn't and it wasn't, but he was in every condition prepared. Yes, intervened. It was the one thing nobody had ever been able to take from him, not even the 8 years when it had felt like everything else was being slowly extracted. Outside the window, Chicago was doing its spring thing, half warm, half something colder moving in from the lake, the city never quite settling until June. Damon opened the North Star file. He read the first page. The second. By the time his team arrived, he already knew what the account needed. He just needed to figure out the right way to deliver it. Carolyn Vance called back on a Wednesday morning, 2 days after Damon had looped in Miles, and after Carradine Holt's legal team had spent 48 hours confirming that nothing about returning the call created exposure for anyone. Clearance came through at 9:17 a.m. Damon called her at 9:20. She picked up immediately, which told him she'd been waiting. "Mr. Kessler," she said. Her voice was measured, the kind of measured that came from practice rather than personality. "Thank you for returning my call. Of course. You can call me Damon." "Carolyn," she said. "I'll get to the point because I think you'd prefer that." "I would. North Star has been evaluating its advisory relationships over the past 2 quarters. That evaluation has included our current arrangement with Sterling Crest." A brief pause, the kind hid, wasn't hesitation but was meant to let the previous sentence land. "There are aspects of that relationship that are no longer meeting our needs." Damon kept his voice neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Looking for sympathy," Carolyn said, and there was something almost dry in it. "I'm looking for a conversation about whether Carradine Holt Partners would be interested in a competitive process for our strategic advisory account." The account was worth, in annual contract value, somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on the scope of services engaged. Damon knew this not because he'd looked it up after her voicemail. He'd known it before that, from memory, because it was the account he'd spent 6 weeks of his life rebuilding from the foundation. "We would be interested in that conversation," he said. "I want to set expectations clearly before we go further. This is a competitive process. Sterling Crest will be given the opportunity to retain the account through the same process. I'm not calling you because the decision is already made. I understand. I'm calling you," she said, "because when our team sits down and asks itself who actually understood our business, not the relationship, the contract language, the actual operational needs, your name comes up. That's the honest reason." Damon sat with that for a moment. He'd heard versions of professional flattery before, had learned to distinguish it from the real thing. This felt like the real thing, which he respected and also didn't let himself be moved by. "Yet, when are you thinking for initial presentations?" he asked. They spent 17 minutes on logistics. Before hanging up, Carolyn said one more thing. "I'm going to tell you something that's probably not my place to say, but I think you should have it. Okay. When North Star asked Sterling Crest about the gaps in our service over the last several months, their response was not adequate. And at one point, someone in that meeting suggested the problems originated on our end, with our team's inability to effectively utilize the services being provided. She let that sit. That's when we decided a competitive process was necessary." After he hung up, Damon sat in his office for a few minutes and looked at nothing in particular. He wasn't savoring anything. He wasn't thinking about Brielle. He was just sitting with the information, organizing it, figuring out what it actually meant for the work ahead. Then he got up, walked to Miles's office, knocked on the open door, and delivered the summary in about 4 minutes. Miles listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. "Timeline," he said when Damon finished. "Initial presentations in 6 weeks. Decision 30 days after that." Miles leaned back. "What do you need?" "Ruben and Priya for the preparation work. Access to the research team for industry context. and I need you to be in the room for the final presentation. Miles raised an eyebrow. You don't need me in the room, Damon said, but having you there tells North something about how Carradine Holt values the account. It's a signal, not a crutch. Miles looked at him for a moment, the assessing look that Damon had gotten used to. All right, he said. You've got it. The 6 weeks of preparation were, in their own way, as grinding as the 6 weeks Damon had once spent rebuilding the North Star account at Sterling Crest. Different kind of grinding forward-facing, rather than repair work. Building an argument rather than fixing a leak, but the hours were real, and the stakes were clear, and the pressure of knowing that Sterling Crest was in the same process was a specific kind of pressure that required active management. He told his team about North Star on the morning after the call with Carolyn. He sat them down in the conference room, explained what the opportunity was, what the competitive process involved, and what he expected from each of them. He didn't frame it as a chance to stick it to a competitor. He didn't mention his history with the account at all. Rubin asked the question Damon had expected. Isn't this your old account? From Sterling Crest? I built the relationship while I was there, Damon said. Which means I understand the client well. It also means we're going to be scrupulously careful about what we use in our preparation. Thing from my time at Sterling Crest that isn't publicly available or that I couldn't have learned from a conversation with the client directly. Legal has already set the parameters. We work inside them. Even if it costs us the account, Rubin asked. Even then, Damon said. Because the alternative is winning the account in a way that creates legal exposure, and more to the point that I'm willing to do. Rubin nodded. Janet was writing something on her legal pad. Priya had already opened her laptop. Owen was very still in the way he got when he was paying close attention and didn't want anyone to notice. Okay, Janet said. Where do we start? They started with the public record on North Star Aerospace Industry Analysis, earnings reports, trade publications, anything that mapped the company's direction over the last 3 years. They requested a preliminary conversation with Carolyn Vance's team to understand current pain points, framed not as a sales conversation, but as a discovery process. Carolyn agreed to it, which meant Sterling Crest's team would likely get the same meeting, which was fine. Damon wasn't looking for an unfair advantage. He was looking for a better answer. The discovery call with North Star's team was an hour and 40 minutes, which was longer than scheduled because the people on the other end had things they wanted to say, and Damon had learned years ago that you let them say it. So, he asked questions. He took notes. At one point, a mid-level manager named Dennis, who clearly hadn't been briefed to be careful, said something that crystallized the problem. It's like our current firm understands the language of our industry, but not the actual mechanics. We get reports that look right, but when we try to act on them, the action doesn't land. Damon wrote that down verbatim. Then he said, "Can you give me a specific example?" Dennis looked at his colleagues, who didn't stop him, so he gave a specific example. And then another. By the end of the call, Damon had 4 pages of notes and a very clear picture of exactly what North Star needed that they hadn't been getting. On the drive home, that evening, he was still driving, hadn't gotten around to figuring out the train schedule from the new office, which was on his list of things to address that kept getting displaced by more immediate things he thought about what Sterling Crest was going to present in 6 weeks. He knew how they'd approach it. He'd seen it. Professional deck, well-designed, full of credential language and client testimonials and value propositions built around the firm's reputation and market position. All of it accurate, none of it answering the question Dennis had raised on that call. Sterling Crest sold its name. That had always been most of the pitch. The name was legitimately good, which made the approach legitimately effective most of the time. But there was a specific category of client, the ones who'd already bought the name and found it insufficient, where the approach fell apart. North Star was now in that category. The preparation went well until the 3rd week, when it didn't. Rubin came into Damon's office on a Tuesday afternoon with the look of someone carrying bad news with reasonable dignity. The industry analysis for the aerospace sector is outdated, he said. The research team is working from a framework that's 18 months behind the current regulatory environment. Q3 compliance shifts happened after they last updated their model. Damon looked at him. How far off does it make our projections? Catastrophically. But there are two sections of the presentation where we'd be recommending approaches that wouldn't account for the new requirements. Northstar's team would catch it immediately. Okay, Damon pulled up his calendar. Can the research team fix it by Friday? They're saying next Wednesday. That's a problem. We have an internal review on Monday. He looked at Ruben. Can you and Priya patch the two sections manually by Thursday? I'll carry the additional work on the industry context. Ruben did the math visibly in his expression. Yeah. Be a late week. I know. Tell Priya. And tell Owen I need the client timeline graphic rebuilt from scratch. The current version uses the old regulatory calendar. Ruben started to leave. Ruben, Damon said. He stopped. Good catch. Ruben made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Just didn't want to walk into that room with bad information. That's the whole job, Damon said. The week was late in the way weeks get, when multiple things require simultaneous attention, and none of them can be deprioritized. Damon came in early Thursday and found Priya already at her desk at 7:15, her second coffee already half gone, the updated section open on her screen. Have to be here this early, he told her. She said, but the section was bothering me, and I couldn't sleep. He looked at the screen. She'd not only fixed the regulatory gaps, she'd restructured the entire so it was tighter, more specific, more directly tied to what Northstar's team had said on the discovery call. This is better than my draft, he said. A little bit, she said, carefully neutral. More than a little bit. He pulled up a chair. Walk me through your reasoning on the second paragraph. They worked side by side for an hour, the office quiet around them, the city coming to life outside the windows in the particular unhurried way it does before 7 a.m., when even Chicago hasn't fully committed to the day yet. And Damon thought, for the first time, one of the things he hadn't anticipated about having a team that was actually his to direct, his to develop, his to be accountable for, was that it was occasionally humbling, in a way that felt like exactly the right thing. He hadn't expected to be outwritten by his 26-year-old analyst on a Thursday morning. But she'd outwritten him, and acknowledging it took about 4 seconds, and then they moved forward. The internal review on Monday went well. Miles sat in for the last 40 minutes, asked 2 pointed questions, one about pricing structure, one about transition methodology, and seemed satisfied with the answers. He didn't say much afterward, just clapped Damon once on the shoulder in the hallway and kept walking, which was about as effusive as Miles Carradine got. Presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Conference center on the 31st floor of a building in the Loop, neutral ground, the kind of setup designed to feel like no one had an advantage. Northstar's team would spend the morning with Sterling Crest and the afternoon with Carradine Holt. Carolyn had been transparent about the structure. No games, she'd said. Just give us your best. Damon arrived 40 minutes early with Ruben, Priya, and Miles. Owen had stayed at the office at Damon's suggestion. There was real work to be done, and the presentation team was as large as it needed to be. They set up the room in 20 minutes. Damon checked the slide deck twice, not because he didn't trust it, but because checking twice was the kind of thing you did. Conference center had a bank of windows along one wall. While Ruben and Priya ran through logistics and Miles answered emails on his phone, Damon stood at the window and looked down at the street below. The city was doing what Chicago did on overcast June mornings, which was refuse to be diminished by the streets moving with the particular organized urgency of a place that takes its own productivity seriously. His phone buzzed. Lila, good luck today, Dad. He looked at the message for a moment. He hadn't told her the specifics she was 8. The specifics were not for her, but she'd registered that this week mattered because she paid attention to him in the way children pay attention to the one parent they have, which is thoroughly and without filter. Thank you, Bug, he typed back. I'll tell you how it goes. I'll make a sign, she sent. He put the phone in his pocket and turned back to the room. North Star's team arrived at 1:43 for the 2 o'clock meeting. Carolyn Vance was first through the door, tall, efficient in her movements, wearing the particular neutral expression of someone who'd spent the morning watching a competitor's presentation and was not ready to reveal what she'd thought of it. Behind her came 3 members of her team, 2 of whom Damon recognized from the discovery call, and then Gerald Pritchard. Gerald had aged about 3 years in the 12 months since Damon had last spoken to him. There were things that did that to people. He stopped when he saw Damon, and something moved across his face that took a second to resolve into recognition, and then into something more complicated. "Damon," he said. "Gerald, good to see you." There was a moment where neither of them quite knew what the correct thing was, given the specific history. Given that the last time they'd spoken, Damon had been calling from a kitchen at 6:45 a.m. to tell Gerald not to make any calls yet. "Give me today." In the end, Gerald extended his hand and Damon shook it, and they both let the moment pass without commentary, which was the professional thing, and also, under the circumstances, the human thing. Carolyn made brief introductions, and they settled in. The room had 12 chairs around a central table, and North Star's 6 people took one side. Damon's 4 took the other, with Miles at the end in the position that communicated seniority without requiring it to be announced. "We appreciate the opportunity," Damon started, and then he said what he'd decided to say at the top, which he'd debated with himself about for 3 days before committing to it. "I want to acknowledge something before we begin. I have prior experience with this account from a different firm. That history has not been a source of material in our preparation. Everything you're going to see today is built from publicly available information, our discovery organization, and Carradine Holt's independent research and methodology. I want that on the record, and I'm happy to answer any questions about process before we go further." Carolyn looked at him. "We're aware of your background," she said. "It's part of why you're in this room. Please proceed." He proceeded. The presentation ran 94 minutes. Damon had built it around a central argument rather than a credential showcase. The argument, yes, stated plainly in the first 5 minutes, was this: North Star's problems with advisory services were not about the quality of analysis it was receiving. They were about the gap between what was being delivered and what North Star's team could operationally act upon. The firm they needed wasn't the one with the most impressive institutional reputation. It was the one that could translate strategic insight into operational reality at the speed North Star's business actually moved. Everything that followed served that argument. The regulatory analysis, Priya's version, which was stronger than his demonstrated specific knowledge of North Star's compliance environment. The then communication protocol they proposed was built directly from what Dennis and his colleagues had said on the discovery call, specific enough that Dennis visibly reacted when he saw it. The transition methodology addressed the question Miles had raised in the internal review, which it turned out was the same question that North Star's CFO, quiet man named Barrett, who spoke for the first time at the 40-minute mark, had been sitting with. There was no moment of dramatic revelation, no slide that landed with a gasp, just a presentation that knew what it was trying to say and said it thoroughly, without wasted motion. The 80-minute mark, Damon advanced to a slide and stopped, because Brielle Langston had just walked through the door. Sterling Crest was presenting that morning. He had not known Brielle was going to stay for the afternoon session. It was not standard practice, and it told him something about how much Sterling Crest understood the situation to be at risk. She stopped, and she saw him. It was a fraction of a second, the kind of stop that trained professionals learn to suppress, and that the body does anyway. And then she kept moving to a chair along the far wall, the observer's position, behind her team. She was 30 years old, and she looked, to Damon's honest assessment, like someone who had been having a difficult few months. Broken, not diminished in any important way, but carrying something. Particular tension of a person who's been managing a situation that isn't cooperating. Their eyes met for approximately 1 second. Damon held it without expression, then looked back at the room. Question North Star needs answered, he said, continuing exactly where he'd left off, isn't who has the best reputation in this market. That's a settled question, and that's a settled firms that can make a reasonable claim. Question is who is going to be accountable for whether the work we deliver actually lands, whether it's technically correct, whether it's useful. Advance the slide. That accountability is what we're proposing. A service level agreement. Note a client satisfaction survey. Structural commitment to measurable operational impact, reviewed quarterly, with explicit remediation protocols if the standard isn't met. The CFO leaned forward. Define measurable operational impact in your framework. Damon nodded, because it was exactly the right question, and he'd been hoping someone would ask it explicitly. 3 metrics, he said, and walked through them, with the specificity that only came from having actually thought it through, rather than having constructed it to sound thorough. Behind the Sterling Crest team, Brielle was very still. He was aware of her the way you're aware of weather, a thing in the environment, real, requiring acknowledgement, not requiring response. He didn't look at her again. There was no point in it. She was watching a presentation, and the presentation was the thing. When he finished, Carolyn asked 4 questions. Her team asked 7. Barrett asked 2 more. Damon answered all of them. Rubin handled one about transition timeline without being prompted. Miles, when Carolyn asked about Carradine Holt's institutional commitment to the account, a question that was really a question about what happened if Damon left. She didn't phrase it that way, answered in a way that was clear and unadorned. Strategic accounts of this size get CEO attention. Just in the pitch. The meeting wrapped at 4:17. North Star's team stood. There were handshakes. There was the controlled professional warmth of a conversation that had gone well but in which nobody was ready to say so. Gerald Pritchard shook Damon's hand again on the way out. He held it a beat, longer than necessary. The operational impact framework, he said quietly. That's what we asked for. 18 months ago, before things started to slip. Damon looked at him. I know, he said. Gerald nodded once and followed his colleagues out. Carradine Holt team stayed to collect materials. Miles was talking to Rubin. Priya was quietly disassembling the presentation setup with the methodical efficiency she brought to most things. The room was emptying. Brielle was still there. She was standing near the window, the same bank of windows Damon had stood at 40 minutes before the meeting started. She was hidmutsto, looking at the street below with the posture of someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the right moment. Thought about walking past her. He could. There was nothing that required this conversation. Stopped, because avoiding it felt like its own kind of performance, and Damon didn't do performances. Brielle, he said. She turned. Up close, the composure was more careful than it had looked from across the room. Like something being actively maintained. You were good, she said. Thank you. A moment of quiet between them that was not comfortable, but also wasn't hostile. How long have you been working on that framework? She asked. The operational impact structure. About 3 weeks. Something crossed her face. We've been talking about a version of that concept internally for 8 months, she said. We never built it into anything formal. He didn't say anything to that. What was there to say? I want to ask you something, Brielle said. Professionally. Not this isn't a recruitment conversation. I just need to understand something. Okay, when you left. Did you already know it would come to this? He thought about the parking garage. Leela's mismatched socks at the kitchen table. Sandra's pen and the 3 drafts of the resignation letter. He said honestly, I didn't know about any of this. I left because of what that conversation told me, not because of what I thought would happen next. She looked at him for a long moment. The accusation, she said. The legal letter. That was I was trying to protect the company's position. I convinced myself there was a basis for it. There wasn't. That now. The admission was real. He could tell the difference. He gave it the acknowledgement it deserved, which was a single nod and nothing more. He wasn't in the business of absolution, and she wasn't asking for it anyway. For what it's worth, she said, and she seemed to be choosing the words carefully. It was unfamiliar on her. The bonus was wrong. Calculation. The rationale, it wasn't right. He said. It wasn't. Another moment. Outside, Chicago continued its business with complete indifference, the conversation happening 31 floors above it. North Star's going to go with you, Brielle said, not bitterly. Just stating a thing she'd clearly already calculated. Tell in the room. I don't know that, Damon said, which was technically true. He thought it was likely. He didn't say that. Miles appeared at Damon's peripheral vision, far enough away to not be interrupting but close enough to be available. Damon recognized the signal. I need to go, he said. Brielle nodded. Then she said, with a slight wryness that was the first thing she'd said in the entire conversation that sounded like herself, you still do that thing where you button your jacket before you walk away from a difficult conversation. He looked down. He had in fact buttoned his jacket. He hadn't noticed. Old habit, he said. He walked toward Miles and Ruben and Priya, and they gathered their things, and they took the elevator down together. In the lobby, Ruben exhaled loudly enough that Priya looked at him. Miles checked his phone. Damon held the door open for all three of them and followed them out into the June afternoon. How are you feeling? Ruben asked, once they were on the sidewalk. Damon thought about the room, about Dennis leaning forward when he saw his own words reflected back in the protocol slide, about Barrett's question and the way Miles had answered it. Gerald Pritchard's handshake. I think we gave them what they needed, he said. The rest isn't ours to control. Ruben looked like he wanted to say more but didn't, which was the right instinct. They walked back toward the office in the overcast, June afternoon, 4 people who'd done the work that was theirs to do, and now had to wait for the world to respond in its own time. Damon's phone buzzed. Lila, a photo this time, a hand-drawn sign on the back of a cereal box, purple crayon, which said Dad is the best at his job in letters of varying sizes. The sign had a small drawing in the corner that he thought was meant to be him in a tie, though it was also possibly a rocket ship. He laughed, an actual laugh, the kind that just arrives without announcement. Ruben and Priya looked at him. My daughter, he said, and showed them the sign. Priya smiled. Ruben said, Is that a rocket ship in the corner? Think it's me, Damon said. It's a good likeness, Ruben said. Miles, walking slightly ahead of them, glanced back briefly at whatever sound Damon was making. He looked forward again and kept walking and allowed the moment to be what it was, which was the right thing, and which was one of the reasons Damon had come to respect him. The city moved around them, loud and indifferent and alive, in the particular way of American cities in the middle of the day, and the 4 of them walked back toward the building, where the work was still waiting. The work was the thing that mattered, and the rest would come when it came. Call from Carolyn Vance came on a Monday morning 31 days after the presentation. Damon was at his desk reading through a client report when his cell phone lit up with her name. He'd been waiting for this call, the way you wait for medical results, not obsessively, not constantly, with a low background awareness that it was coming, and that when it came, it would either confirm or revise everything you'd been working toward. He set down his coffee, cleared his throat once for no particular reason, and answered. Carol Damon. A brief pause. North Star's board met on Friday. We've reached a decision on the advisory account. I'm listening. Carradine Holt Partners has been selected for exclusive contract negotiations. Another pause. Shorter. We'd like to move quickly on the process. Can you and Miles be available this week for an initial scope conversation? Kept his voice even. We can make that work. Good. Yes, he'd intervened, and then departing briefly from the efficient register she'd maintained through every conversation they'd had. For what it's worth, the operational impact framework was the deciding factor. The board spent most of Friday on it. It answered questions they didn't know how to ask. I'll pass that to my team, he said. They built most of it. A small silence on her end, the kind that suggested she was recalibrating something. That's an interesting thing to say. It's accurate, Damon said. After he hung up, he sat for exactly 30 seconds doing nothing. Celebrating. There was no celebrating alone in a quiet office in a useful way, just sitting with the information while it settled from news into fact. He walked to Miles's office, knocked, went in, and delivered it in 2 sentences. Miles looked at him for a moment. Then he stood up from his desk, crossed the room, and shook Damon's hand with both of his, which was Miles Carradine, the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. "Tell your team before you tell anyone else," Miles said. Already planned to. He gathered Ruben, Priya, Janet, and Owen in the conference room 5 minutes later. He told them plainly North Star chose Carradine Holt. Negotiations begin this week. The operational impact framework was specifically cited by the board. He watched their faces move through the information at different speeds. Ruben's immediate satisfaction, the kind worn openly. Priya's quieter version of the same thing, a small, controlled smile that she directed at her legal pad. Janet's nod, the nod of someone who'd seen enough outcomes to know that good ones deserved acknowledgement but not inflation. Barely suppressed need to react more loudly than the room's register permitted, which he managed, barely. Priya, Damon said. The board cited the framework specifically. That section was yours. She looked up. It was a collaboration. It was a collaboration that you made better at 7 a.m. on a Thursday when you couldn't sleep. Take the credit for the right part. She held his gaze for a moment. Okay, she said. Thank you. All right, Damon said and stood up. We've got a scope conversation with North Star this week and a contract to negotiate. Let's not spend the next hour congratulating ourselves. Ruben made a sound of protest. Can we have maybe 20 minutes? You can have lunch, Damon said, which he meant sincerely, which was, for a Tuesday at Carradine Holt, something. They went to the Thai place 2 blocks over that Ruben had been advocating for since Damon arrived. It was small and loud, and the tables were too close together, and the food was, as Ruben had promised on multiple occasions, genuinely excellent. They ate and talked about things that were not work for approximately 40 minutes, which was the most sustained non-work conversation Damon had engaged in with his team since starting, yet he registered, sitting in that small, loud restaurant in the middle of a Tuesday, that this was also part of the job. The soft part, just another part. He called Lila from the sidewalk afterward, while Ruben and Priya argued about something inconsequential, heading back toward the office. We got the account, Bug, he said when she picked up. Pause while she processed. Lila processed things at her own speed, which was deliberate, which he respected. The big one you were worried about? I wasn't worried. Dad, you had your worry face for like a whole month. I had my focused face. Those look the same on you, she said. But that's really good. Does that mean you'll be home for dinner? It means I'll be home for dinner. Extra cheese pizza Friday? Tuesday. I'm planning ahead, she said with complete seriousness. Extra cheese, he confirmed, and hung up. At Sterling Crest, the news about North Star arrived with the particular velocity that bad news achieves in organizations where people are already watching for it. Damon didn't know the specifics of how the internal communication went. He knew enough about how those organizations worked to reconstruct the outline. Tolliver informing Brielle. Brielle's response rippling outward through whatever chain of damage control she attempted. The board receiving the information either through official channels or, more likely, through the informal networks is no, that boards inevitably maintain in companies where they've started to have concerns. He knew the board had started to have concerns because Marcus called him on a Wednesday evening, 3 days after the North Star decision, and Marcus never called in the evenings. I'm going to tell you something. Marcus said, without preamble, and I want you to understand I'm not telling you because I want anything from you. I'm telling you because we've been colleagues for 8 years, and I think you should know. Okay, the board called an emergency session yesterday. They've been conducting an internal review for the past 6 weeks. I didn't know about it until now. Most people didn't, and it's about the North Star situation and the bonus allocations from last quarter and the quarter before that. A pause. Probably some other things I'm not fully aware of. Yes, he'd intervened. Damon was standing at his kitchen window, watching the neighbor's cat navigate the back fence with implausible confidence. Is this something I need to prepare for legally? Your name comes up only as context as the account manager whose departure preceded the North Star deterioration. You're not a subject of the review. Okay, I thought you should know how things are here. Marcus's voice had the quality of someone saying more than the words. It's not good, Damon. I'm sorry to hear that, he said, and meant it in the way you mean things that are true but complicated. After he hung up, he stood at the window a while longer. Cat had made it across the fence and disappeared into the next yard. The evening was that particular late June blue that Chicago gets when the weather is being cooperative, which it wasn't always and wasn't required to be. He wasn't glad about what was happening at Sterling Crest. That would have required a kind of scorekeeping he'd never seen the point of. And it would have required caring about Brielle Langston's circumstances more than he cared about his own, which was its own kind of trap. What he felt was closer to something he didn't have a clean word for, a recognition that consequences move at their own pace and in their own direction and don't require your attention to arrive. He went inside, checked on Lila, who was asleep with a book open on her face, in the particular way she'd been sleeping since she was 5, removed the book, turned off the light, and went to bed himself. The board's investigation at Sterling Crest was thorough, which was the thing Brielle had probably not anticipated. She was accustomed to a board that operated at strategic altitude, reviewing quarterly numbers, approving major structural decisions, attending functions, kind of board that trusts operational execution to the CEO until it has specific reasons not to. They now had specific reasons. What they found over the following weeks, and this reached Damon not through Marcus but through the less comfortable channel of an actual formal inquiry. A letter from Sterling Crest's board chair requesting his account of the circumstance surrounding his departure was a picture that Brielle had probably believed would never be assembled in full because the pieces were in too many different places. The letter was professional and specific. The board chair, a man named Hargreaves, who Damon had met once at a company function and who had struck him as the kind of person who asked questions he already knew the answers to, wanted Damon's account of the bonus reduction, conversation in which it was communicated, and the circumstances of the legal accusation that had followed his departure. Called Sandra before responding to anything. "This is a board inquiry," she said, reading the letter he'd photographed. "Legal action. They're building a factual record. You can respond voluntarily and shape your part of the record, or you can decline and let them draw their own conclusions from other sources. What would you do?" "I'd respond," she said. "You have a clean record on everything they're asking about. Your transition plan, your system access logs, the legal accusation, all of it supports your version. Let them see that." He drafted the response over 2 evenings. At the office at the kitchen table, after Lila was in bed, the way he drafted the resignation letter 7 months ago, in the same chair. He wrote it in plain language that said what happened without editorializing. Attached the documentation Sandra specified and sent it through her by the end of the week. 3 weeks later, Hargreaves called him directly. It was a short call, 10 minutes. The board chair thanked him for the detailed response, confirmed that the documentation had been reviewed, and said with the careful language of someone choosing every word deliberately that the board's investigation had uncovered information consistent with Damon's account of the circumstances. "Mr. Kessler," Hargreaves said, the end of the call, "I want to ask you something that's outside the formal scope of this inquiry." "All right. In your time at Sterling Crest, over 8 years, did you raise concerns about the compensation structure through formal channels?" Damon thought about it honestly. "I raised it once, informally, with Tolliver. About 18 months before I left. He told me the structure was set by senior leadership and wasn't something he could affect." "And you didn't pursue it further?" "No." A pause. "Why not?" Damon considered the question. "It wasn't hostile. It was genuinely curious, the question of a man trying to understand how a situation had developed the way it had. Because I believed the work would eventually speak for itself, he said. And because I had a daughter to support, and I didn't want to become the person who was difficult to retain. And when it became clear, the work wasn't speaking for itself. I left, Damon said. Hargreaves was quiet for a moment. Thank you for your time, he said, and for the quality of the transition documentation you left behind. Several people on the board mentioned it specifically. Clients deserved a proper handoff, Damon said. After the call, he sat in his office with the door closed for a few minutes. Processing anything dramatic, just sitting with the specific feeling of having told the truth about something difficult and found that it held up under examination. It wasn't triumph. It was more like the structural integrity test passing on a building you'd already been living in. The news about the board's actions at Sterling Crest came in pieces over the following weeks, through the channels that such news travels in the financial advisory world, which is a smaller professional community than it appears from outside. What Damon understood, assembled from sources he neither solicited nor interrogated, was this: the board had moved to limit Brielle's direct authority over compensation decisions, had removed client strategy from her sole control and installed a management committee, and had brought in an outside firm to conduct a broader operational review. She remained CEO. The board had not removed her. Whether that was pragmatism, she still held significant equity. The Langston name was still on the letterhead. The disruption of a full leadership change would compound the operational problems already in play. Or whether it was a genuine belief that she could adapt under structured oversight, Damon didn't know and didn't spend much time speculating about. It wasn't his company. It had never really felt like his company, which was probably part of the problem. What he knew, in concrete terms, was that the North Star contract negotiation was going well, that his team was performing at a level that had prompted Miles to schedule a department review 6 months ahead of the normal cycle, and that Prius had submitted an analysis on a secondary North Star account opportunity that was, in Miles's words after reading it, the best unsolicited strategic memo I've read in 2 years. He told Priya this in a one-on-one meeting and watched her process it with the characteristic controlled reaction of someone who'd been quietly waiting for confirmation that the work was landing. Miles reads unsolicited memos, she said. Apparently he reads yours. She looked at her legal pad. Should I send more? Send them when you have something worth saying, he said. More often than that. That's what makes them worth reading. She nodded. Then, after a moment, can I ask you something? You were at Sterling Crest, was it like this? The team dynamic? He thought about Marcus and his 3 rotating ties. About Tolliver studying the table surface. About 8 years of work that lived in relationships and institutional memory, and the 1,000 small negotiations of keeping difficult clients from walking out the door, all of it largely invisible to the people who controlled the compensation decisions. He said, It wasn't. Did you know it was different somewhere else? For certain, he said. I thought it might be. He looked at her. That's part of why leaving felt like a risk, even when I knew it was the right call. You don't always know what you're walking toward. You just know what you've stopped tolerating. Priya was quiet for a moment, writing something down that was probably not work-related. That's a useful thing to know, she said. It's also terrifying, he said. Yes, she agreed, but still useful. The meeting with Brielle happened on a Thursday in August, 2 months after North Star's decision. She requested it through formal channels and emailed to Miles's assistant, asking for a meeting with Damon, framing it as a professional conversation. Miles showed him the request and asked whether he wanted to take it. Damon thought about it for a day. Not because he was afraid of the conversation, he wasn't, but because he wanted to be sure of his own reasons for agreeing to it. Because he was curious wasn't good enough. Going because he thought she deserved the chance to say whatever she needed to say was closer to right. Because it was the professional thing, and he'd always defaulted to the professional thing, when the professional thing was also the decent thing that was probably the actual reason. He told Miles he'd take the meeting. They met at a hotel restaurant near Sterling Crest's building on a Thursday at noon, neutral ground again, which she'd chosen and which he appreciated. She was there when he arrived, already seated, a glass of water in front of her that she was holding with both hands, a posture he didn't think she was aware of. She looked better than she had at the conference room window 2 months ago. Not in the sense of recovering, more like she'd made a decision about something, and the decision had settled in her face. He sat down. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." A waiter appeared. They ordered coffee without looking at the menu, and then they were alone in the particular restaurant, quiet of a lunch hour that hadn't fully arrived yet. "I'll get to the point," Brielle said, which was as French Eanes, the same thing Carolyn Vance had said when she called him about North Star. People said that to him often. He'd never decided if it was because he looked like someone who wanted efficiency, or because it was what people said when they were nervous and trying not to seem it. "Spent the last 2 months doing a lot of reckoning," she said. "The board review, with the North Star situation, with everything that's happened since you left. And I've come to some conclusions I want you to hear directly." "I'm listening," he said. "The bonus reduction was wrong. I knew the performance metrics supported your full bonus. I made an allocation decision that served senior leadership incentives at the expense of what it actually earned, and I justified it to myself with a rationale that I knew wasn't solid." She said this with the directness of someone who'd rehearsed it enough times that it had stopped feeling rehearsed. "The way I framed it to you, using your situation as a father, that was a manipulation. I knew what I was doing." He didn't say anything. The confession was real, and it deserved to be received without interruption. "The legal accusation," she continued, "was me panicking. I convinced myself there was a basis for it, because I needed there to be one. Because if you'd left cleanly, with nothing wrong on your end, then everything wrong was on mine." She looked at her water glass. "The investigation confirmed what you told us. You left cleaner than most people do." He said, "I know. You know." She looked up. "I'm not telling you this because I expect anything from it. I'm telling you because you were at our firm for 8 years. Deserved better than what you got in that conference room. You deserved better for a long time before that, probably. And I was so focused on what I was building and protecting that I treated your value like a budget line I could adjust." The waiter brought coffee. They both reached for it. At the same time, the small, awkward mechanics of 2 people in an uncomfortable conversation doing something ordinary with their hands. Damon took a sip, set the cup down. He thought about the right thing to say. The gracious thing, not the cutting thing, the true thing. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and it's not going to be what you're expecting to hear." She waited. "You didn't misunderstand my ability," he said. "Knew what I could do. 8 years of evidence, pretty hard to misread." He looked at her steadily. "What you misunderstood was its value. Those are different things. Someone can do something, and understanding what it's worth to you, those aren't the same calculation. You got the first one right, and got the second one wrong." Consistently, she held his gaze. Something moved in her expression that was not quite pain, but was adjacent to it. "The difference," he continued, "is that misunderstanding ability is a perceptual error. Misunderstanding value is a choice. Maybe not a conscious choice every time. Gets made, and it gets made again. At some point, it's not a mistake anymore. It's a policy." The restaurant had filled up around them while they were talking. The lunch crowd, arriving in the specific Chicago way of everyone at once, and the noise level had risen, enough that their conversation was private without effort. "That's fair," Brielle said, after a moment. "That's the fairest thing anyone said to me about this." "It's not meant to be fair," Damon said. "It's just accurate." She almost smiled. "You've always been like that, even in meetings. Everyone else trying to manage the impression, and you just saying the thing." "It's easier," he said. "Managing impressions is exhausting." "It is," she said, and she sounded, for the first time in the conversation, genuinely tired. Performed. Just tired. She reached into her bag and withdrew a folder, which she set on the table between them. "This is what I came to offer you," she said. "I talked to the board. They supported it. Executive Vice President of Strategic Client Development. Compensation package base, guaranteed quarterly bonus structure tied to measurable outcomes, equity participation in the firm's growth over a 5-year horizon." She pushed it toward him. "Everything you should have had." He looked at the folder without opening it. "You're going to say no," she said. "Yes," he said. "Can I ask why? And I mean the real reason, not the professional answer." He thought about it. The real reason had several layers, and he decided to give her the one that was both true and useful. "Because the work I'm doing now is mine in a way it couldn't be there," he said. "Because of the title or the compensation, though those matter. Because of the accountability structure. Because when something succeeds or fails, where I am now, the connection between what I did and what happened is clear. Sterling Crest, for 8 years, that connection was always being managed by someone else." He paused. "I need to work somewhere. That connection is real. It's not about you specifically. It's about what I need the work to mean." Brielle sat with that. She looked at the folder, then pushed it to the side in a gesture that was more resolving than dismissing. "What the board said in their review about your transition plan?" "What?" They called it the most thorough offboarding documentation they'd ever seen from a departing employee. Used it as an example in the operational review of what the standard should be. She shook her head slightly. "You left, and the way you left made us look at everything we hadn't been doing." "I left it for the clients," he said. "I've mentioned that before. That's what makes it impressive." She took a breath. And maddening. He felt unexpectedly a small flicker of something almost like warmth toward her. Forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness implied a wound that needed healing, and what he felt taught this situation was more like scar tissue, present and durable. But something. She was 30 years old, and she'd been handed a significant amount of power at an age when most people are still figuring out how to be in rooms with it, and she'd made consequential mistakes, and she was sitting across from him at a restaurant on a Thursday accepting the accounting of those mistakes without deflection. That took something. For what it's worth, he said the operational changes the board made sound right. The oversight structure, the compensation committee, those are the things that should have been there. They should have been there from the beginning, she said. Father didn't build them in because he didn't want anyone second-guessing him. And I didn't change them because I thought the same way. A pause. That's a pattern, apparently. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him directly, the way she had in that first bonus meeting, but without the armor. Are you doing well, Damon? Honestly. He thought about Lila's volcano kit and the purple birthday cake and the cereal box sign that was now, slightly embarrassingly, tucked in his desk drawer at work. He thought about Priya's 7 a.m. coffee and Ruben's restless energy finally being used for something, and Janet's quiet competence, and Owen slowly becoming the person he was going to be. He thought about Miles's two-handed handshake and the north-facing window and coming home for dinner most nights. Yes, he said. I'm doing well. She nodded, and something in her posture released slightly, the way people release when they've received information they needed to be true but weren't sure of. They finished their coffee. The conversation moved, in its final minutes, into the ordinary small talk of two professionals who had run out of difficult things to say and hadn't quite found the exit. They talked briefly about the market, about a conference they'd both apparently been invited to in September. It was slightly awkward, the way endings are when neither person is sure exactly when the ending happens. When he stood to leave, she stood too. One more thing, she said. He paused. Lila, she said. I hope she's good. He looked at her for a moment. It was the right thing to say in a way that surprised him, because it acknowledged the part of the original conversation that had been most wrong without reopening it. Just a recognition, just seeing it. She's great, he said. She's really great. He walked out of the restaurant into the August afternoon, which was warm and honest about it, the kind of Chicago summer day that earned its reputation. Stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not buttoning his jacket because he hadn't worn one, which was an August departure from habit that felt appropriate. turned to the parking structure and walked, and the city moved around him, and he did not look back. The North Star contract was signed on a Tuesday in September, 6 weeks after the restaurant lunch with Brielle, 8 weeks after Carolyn Vance's Monday morning call, and approximately 11 months after Damon had stood in an underground parking garage and called a number he'd been sitting on for 6 months. The signing itself was not dramatic. Conference room at North Star's offices, a legal team on each side, documents moving across a table in the organized sequence that contracts move when everyone has already agreed and is now just making the agreement official. Carolyn signed for North Star. Miles signed for Carradine Holt. Damon sat 2 seats down from Miles and did not sign anything because the signing was not his role. His role was to have done the work that made the signing possible, which was a distinction he'd made peace with a long time ago. Afterward, he's in the elevator, down. Miles said, "Yes, good work, Damon." 2 words. Miles was not a man who inflated things. 2 words from him carried the weight that a longer speech would have carried from someone else, and Damon received it that way. "Good team," Damon said. Miles made the sound he made when he agreed with something, but didn't want to make a production of agreeing. They rode the rest of the way down, in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill every silence. Outside, Damon called his team before he'd reached the parking structure. Ruben picked up first. "How'd it go, signed?" Damon said. A sound on the other end, that was Ruben telling someone nearby Owen. From the secondary voice, and then a muffled small eruption of something that sounded like Priya saying finally in the measured tone she used when she'd been waiting for something for long enough that the relief came out as understated. "Tell Priya the board cited her framework in their internal communications to Carolyn," Damon said. "I heard it this morning, and I've been holding on to it." "She's standing right here," Ruben said. "You can tell her." Shuffling sound, and then Priya's voice. "I heard that," Damon said. "You should hear it." "Thank you," she said, which was all she said. But the way she said it meant considerably more than the 2 syllables. He hung up and sat in his car for a moment before starting it, because he needed to, but because he'd developed a minor habit over the past year, yet of pausing before moving from one thing to the next. Reflection, exactly. More like acknowledgement. One thing was done, was beginning. The pause was the border between them. Then he started the car and drove to Lila's school. He was early. He sat in the pickup line behind a minivan, with a soccer ball decal and a sedan that had clearly transported a very messy child for several years, and he watched the school doors, and when they opened and the kids came out in the organized chaos that school dismissals always were, he spotted Lil immediately, because he always spotted her immediately. Particular combination of her walk and her posture, and the way she carried her backpack with 1 strap instead of 2, despite his repeated suggestions to the contrary. She saw his car and her face did the thing it did, the specific brightness that he'd been the recipient of for 8 years, and that still, without qualification, was the best thing in his life. She got in the back seat, dropped her backpack, and said, "Did you get the contract? How do you know about the contract? You had your worried, but trying not to show it face this morning," she said. "I figured something was happening. I need to work on my face," he said. "You really do. Did you get it?" "Yes," he said. "We got it." "Yes," she said, with the full-body emphasis of an 8-year-old who doesn't have any use for modulated reactions. "Can we celebrate? What kind of celebrating did you have in mind?" "Taco place," she said immediately, which told him she'd already planned this. "And a milkshake. And you have to tell me the whole story." "The whole story?" "The whole story," she confirmed. "Nothing out, except the boring parts. A lot of it is boring parts." "Then summarize those," she said, with the practicality of a person who had clearly thought about this. So he told her the story on the drive to the taco place, the edited version. The version calibrated for an 8-year-old who understood more than most people gave her credit for, but who also didn't need the weight of the legal accusation, or the board investigation, or the specific mechanics of what had happened in the conference room with Brielle. He told her about the presentation, about Priya's framework, about Carolyn's call, the signing. He told it the way you tell a child a story when the story is real, with the shape of it intact, but the sharpest edges rounded because she was 8, and the sharp edges would still be there for her to encounter in her own time. She listened with complete attention, which she gave to things that interested her, and withheld with equal completeness from things that didn't. "So the people at your old job were wrong about you," she said when he'd finished, processing it in the direct way she processed things. "Underestimated the situation," he said. "People do that." Why? He thought about it. It was a better question than most adults would have asked. Because it's easier to assume you understand someone than to actually understand them. Especially when you have power over them and the assumption is convenient. Lila chewed on this along with her taco. "That's mean," she said finally. "It's human," he said. "People aren't always malicious when they do it. Sometimes they just aren't paying enough attention." "That's still mean," she said, with the moral clarity of someone who hadn't yet learned to excuse carelessness with complexity, which he hoped would stay with her as long as possible. "You're not wrong," he said. They drove home with the windows down because it was still warm enough in September, and Lila told him about her day in the meandering way she told him about things, looping between topics with the specific narrative logic of a child for whom everything is connected to everything else. Her friend had gotten a hamster. There was a substitute teacher who let them have free reading time for 20 minutes. Someone at lunch had said something Lila found philosophically questionable. She didn't use those words, but that was the structure of it about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, and Lila had opinions. He listened to all of it. He drove, and she talked, and the city moved past the windows. Yes, he'd intervened, and he thought about none of the things he'd been thinking about for the past 11 months, because there was no room for them and no need for them, and that was exactly right. October arrived, and with it, the specific quality of Chicago autumn that made the city look like a place someone had designed to make people feel things, the angle of the light, the particular red of the maples along the residential streets. Yes, he'd intervened, the cold that arrived at the edges of the afternoon and reminded you that it was coming for real so soon, and you should pay attention to these last weeks while they lasted. Damon had settled into a rhythm at Carradine Holt that had the texture of something sustainable. Perfect sustainability and perfection were not the same thing, and he'd made his peace with that distinction the way adults make peace with most things, gradually and incompletely, and then one day completely. He'd intervened. But sustainable. The work was hard and the hours were sometimes long, and his team drove him periodically into the specific low-grade frustration of managing people who were good but not yet as good as they were going to be, which was just management, and was also, on better days, interesting. Owen had stopped looking 19, not in the physical sense, but in the professional. He'd developed something in the past months, a steadiness that had replaced the visible effort to appear steady. He'd made a mistake on a client timeline in August, a real one that had required remediation, and he'd come to Damon, before Damon had noticed it himself, laid it out plainly, and had a partial solution already in hand. Damon had fixed the problem with him, and then said, "The fact that you came to me immediately is the thing that matters most here," which Owen had clearly needed to hear, and which was also just true. "I almost waited," Owen said. "I thought about it." Damon said, "Most people would have. Coming forward takes more nerve than sitting on it." "Does it get easier?" Damon thought about 8 years of swallowing things at Sterling Crest. About the specific psychic cost of absorbing what was given to you because you'd decided the alternative was worse. "Automatically," he said. "It gets easier in places where it's safe to do it. Find those places and stay in them as much as you can." Owen nodded, with the expression of someone filing something important. Janet had been promoted. Damon had recommended it to Miles in September, a formal recommendation, with a specific rationale, not a favor, a feeling, but a documented case for why her role should expand, and why the accounts she managed would be better served by the additional authority. Miles had agreed, without significant deliberation, which meant he'd been thinking about it already. Janet had come into Damon's office the morning after the offer was extended, sat down across from him, and said, "You didn't have to do that. You'd been doing the work for 2 years without the title," Damon said. "I just said so out loud." She looked at him with the measuring expression she'd worn that first morning in the conference room. "Is that how it works where you came from?" "No," he said. "It's how I think it should work." She sat with that. "Okay," she said. "Then thank you. You're welcome. You have a bigger budget and more to lose. So," she almost smiled. "Motivating," she said, and went back to work. Ruben took on a new account in October, his first as sole lead, without Damon's direct involvement in the strategy. It was a mid-size account, not high stakes enough to be a crisis, if things went imperfectly, but substantial enough that it mattered. Yes, he did. Damon made himself available for questions and said clearly that he expected Ruben to make his own calls and then explain the reasoning, not ask permission first. 3 weeks in, Ruben came to him with a problem. A client communication had gone sideways, the kind of miscommunication that happens when two teams use the same words to mean different things. He'd already drafted a remediation approach. Damon read it. "It's right," he said. "Go do it. You don't want to make any changes? The approach is right. Execute it." Ruben stood there for a moment with the look of someone waiting for more. "That's it?" "That's it," Damon said. "You identified the problem. You built the solution. You came to me to close the loop. That's the job, Ruben. I don't need to put my hands on it." Ruben left, and Damon heard him, through the glass wall of the office, exhale in the hallway. It was the exhale of someone who'd been ready to carry more than he needed to, and had just been told to put some of it down. Damon recognized the sound, because he'd made it himself, in different places, at different points. Yes, he'd intervened, and it was one of the sounds you made when you were starting to understand what it felt like to be trusted rather than just used. The thing he'd learned, not at Sterling Crest but in the years since, was that building a team was different from managing one. Managing was maintenance. Building was something else. It required you to look at the person in front of you and see not just what they were doing today, but what they were going to be capable of in a year. And then make decisions that served that future version rather than just the immediate utility. It was slower. It required you to absorb mistakes that you could have avoided by just doing things yourself. Yes, he'd intervened, but the compounding worked in the other direction too. And by October, his teams was functioning at a level that would have required twice the people 12 months ago. Miles noticed. Miles noticed everything, which was one of his qualities and also slightly unnerving. "How's the team?" he asked, in one of their weekly check-ins in late October. "Good," Damon said. "Ruben's ready for more. Priya should be formally titled as lead analyst. She's been doing the work. She should have the title. Owen has another 8 months before I'd give him real independence, but he's on track. And Janet's the best thing that happened to this department before I got here," Damon said. "She just needed someone to give her room." Miles wrote something down, which he rarely did in these meetings. "And you," he said without looking up. "What about me? How are you?" Damon looked at him. Miles had a way of asking questions that were technically simple and practically specific, and this one fell into that category. He thought about the honest answer, which was not the professional answer, and which Miles, by asking it this way, was clearly requesting. "Yet, better than I've been in a long time," he said. "Not perfect. Some days are harder than others, but better." Miles put the cap on his pen. And then, after a pause that Damon recognized as the space before something real, "I want to talk to you about next year. There's a conversation I want to have with you about the firm's structure, a longer conversation, not for today. But I want you to know it's coming." Damon looked at him. "Okay, nothing alarming," Miles said. "The opposite of alarming." "Right," Damon said, and they moved on. Yes, and he let himself sit with the information without trying to predict it, which was something he'd been getting better at. November brought cold that meant business, and Elila, who had become obsessed with a book series about a girl who could communicate with horses, which meant Damon had read. at her insistence, the first 3 books so he could discuss them with her, which he'd found approximately more engaging than he'd expected and would not be admitting to Reuben. Yes, he'd also, after 9 months of telling himself he'd get to it, finally figured out the train schedule and started taking the L to work 3 days a week, which gave him 40 minutes each way of reading or thinking, or just watching the city move past the windows without obligation. No. And he'd come to value those 40 minutes in the specific way you value the things you didn't know you needed until you had them. He thought sometimes, on those train rides, about what the past year had actually been. Not in the narrative way, the departure, the accusation, the presentation, just the contract, but in the interior way, the way it had felt from inside. The honest accounting was this. He'd spent 8 years in a place that had taken the parts of him that were useful and organized its understanding of him entirely around those parts, which meant that the rest of him, the father, person who was sometimes uncertain and occasionally wrong, and had a daughter who told him his 2 faces looked the same. Those parts had existed outside the frame of the professional relationship entirely. He'd let that happen, partly because he'd needed the stability, and partly because he'd told himself it was just how work worked, and partly because, if he was being fully honest, he hadn't been sure enough of himself to insist otherwise. That was the thing Brielle had exploited, without maybe fully understanding she was exploiting it. His fear of financial instability that was real but manageable. What she'd read as his tether was actually his uncertainty. His not quite believing that what he could do was worth what he knew it should be worth. The half-decade of absorbed slights and adjusted expectations, and watching others take credit for work had done what that kind of thing does. It had deposited doubt in him, and he'd carried it like it was just the weight of being practical. Parking garage had been him finally setting that down. The anger at the bonus reduction, he'd been angry, briefly, in the contained way he was angry about things. What had happened in the parking garage was something quieter. He sat with the question of what he actually believed about himself, separate from what Sterling Crest's compensation decisions implied, separate from what Brielle's conversation had suggested, separate from the accumulated evidence of 8 years of being useful but not valued, and he'd come to a conclusion he was ready to act on. He was good at this work. Not because no one else was.
There were other good people. There were people who were better at specific things, but good enough that the work he did created real value for real people.
And he deserved to be somewhere that understood that connection and built its relationship with him around it, rather than around the leverage. His circumstances gave them over him. It was not a complicated conclusion. It had just taken 8 years and a Thursday morning in a conference room to arrive at it. December arrived. The North Star account was in active operation, 3 months in, and the early metrics were running ahead of the projections. Priya had modeled in the original proposal, which gave Damon the specific satisfaction of being proven right by evidence rather than just by argument. He'd sent Carolyn Vance a brief email when the Q3 numbers came through, just the numbers in 2 sentences. She'd replied within an hour, "This is exactly what we needed to see." Keep going, he kept going. The longer conversation Miles had mentioned in October happened on a Wednesday afternoon in December, with the city visible through the office windows under the first real snowfall of the season, kind of snow that Chicago sends in December to remind you that January is not a rumor. Miles closed the door, which he still rarely did, and sat across from Damon with a folder that he didn't open. "I'm restructuring the senior leadership of the firm," Miles said. "Effective in the new year. I'm creating a managing director role for client strategy, which means the VP level reports into it, and it reports into me. It's a new tier." Damon listened. "I want you in that role," Miles said. "I want your title to match your actual scope. You're not running one department. You're setting the standard for how this firm approaches client relationships across the board." "No, that's a different job than what's on your nameplate." Damon looked at him. "What does it mean structurally?" "Your team stays yours. You also have advisory authority over the other account teams, not direct management, but consultation and standard setting." You'd be involved in any significant client negotiation at the firm level. Miles paused. And the compensation moves accordingly. Significantly. He named a number. Damon kept his face even, which took some effort, because the number was not what he'd expected and was better than it. Why now? Damon asked. Because North Star proved what I already believed when I hired you, Miles said. Yes, he'd intervened, and because I'd like to make the argument for keeping you before someone else makes the argument for taking you. Damon looked at him. Is someone making that argument? Miles made the not quite a smile expression. No one specific. But you're visible in this market now in a way you weren't a year ago. That changes things. He leaned back. I'd rather have this conversation in December than have you come to me in March with an offer from someone else and me scrambling. Damon thought about the parking garage, about Brielle sliding the piece of paper across the conference room table, about the specific mechanics of how trust between an employer and an employee got built, and then, if it got built correctly, what it was capable of holding. I'd want to review the formal structure, he said. The reporting lines, the authority scope, I want it clear before I say yes, not after. That's reasonable, Miles said. I'll have something to you by end of week. I'll have an answer for you by the following Monday. Nodded. Uncapped his pen. Capped it again. Yes, habit. One more thing, he said. What? The advisory authority over the other account teams that's going to require some people to adjust. Some of them have been running their accounts their own way for years, and they're not going to immediately love someone coming in with a standard-setting role. Damon said, How are you planning to approach it? The same way I approach everything, Damon said. Spend the first month listening. Change what I don't understand yet. Set the standard through behavior before I set it through policy. He paused. And tell the truth when something isn't working, and instead of writing it somewhere no one sees. Miles looked at him for a long moment. You said something like that to your team on your first day. I say it because I mean it, Damon said. I know, Miles said. That's why it works. He reviewed the structural documents on Friday evening at the kitchen table, with Lila doing homework across from him, her horsebook sitting on top of the completed worksheet in the specific hierarchy of an 8-year-old's priorities. Sandra called Saturday morning and went through the employment terms with the same methodical care she'd applied to his original offer, finding one clause worth modifying, and calling it correct after that. Called Miles Monday morning before 9. I'll take it, he said. Good, Miles said. And then, Happy New Year, a couple weeks early. Same to you, Damon said, and hung up. He sat at his desk in the morning quiet and looked at the north-facing window and the city beyond it, the December version, gray bright with the specific light that reflected off snow and low cloud in a way that was not warm but was honest about what it was. Thought about something Lee had said at the taco place in September about the people at his old job about him. He told her they hadn't been fully paying attention. She'd said that was mean. He'd said it was human. And she'd said, with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften her moral assessments, that those two things weren't the same excuse. She was right. They weren't. The thing Damon had come to understand, over the course of this year, that had started in a parking garage and arrived here, at a desk with his name on the door, in clean sans serif letters, was that being undervalued was not always visible while it was happening. It accumulated the way interest accumulated silently, with small additions that seemed manageable in isolation, and became significant through time. The moment you saw it tight clearly, really saw the total number, rather than the individual installments, the question became whether you were going to let the accumulation continue, or do something about it. Not intervened. Not for the sake of proving something, not for the satisfaction of watching consequences land on the people who'd created the situation. Just because a person had a right to the accurate value of what they gave, and settling for less than that, when you knew the difference, was its own kind of slow diminishment. Stopped diminishing himself on a Thursday morning 11 months ago. What had followed was not a perfect year, There'd been hard weeks and late nights, and the ongoing ordinary difficulty of raising a child alone and working at the level he worked, and being underneath all of it. Just a person who got tired and made wrong calls and occasionally burned the rice. None of it was the life of someone who'd won something. It was just the life of someone who'd stopped accepting less than they were owed and had found that the alternative was not some elevated and uncomplicated existence, but simply a harder version of a real one, which was all he'd ever actually wanted. He was still at his desk at 5:30 when his phone buzzed. He looked at it expecting Lila, but it was Priya. Read the Q3 North Star Operational Impact Summary. The numbers are holding. Thought you should see it before EOD. After a second, also, good work on the whole year. He read it twice, set the phone down, picked it up and typed back, good work on the whole year yourself. Home. A minute later, already leaving. The pour-overs cleaned and ready for tomorrow. Put the phone in his pocket, closed his laptop, and stood up. Put on his coat, a good one, the one he'd bought in October without telling himself it was a reward, and then recognizing, somewhere around the third, wearing, that it was, and turned off the desk lamp. And the office went to the gray-blue of a city evening filtering through north-facing glass. He walked out. That's through the quiet late-day office, past Ruben's empty desk and Janet's carefully organized workspace and Owen's desk, where the horsebook Lila had lent him. He'd mentioned the series in passing. Yes, which Lila had interpreted as an invitation and followed through on with characteristic thoroughness, was sitting next to his monitor. He took the elevator down. In the lobby, there was no particular quality of light. It was just a lobby. December, 6 o'clock, Chicago. He walked out. The train was 3 minutes away, according to the app. He walked the 2 blocks to the station with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath visible in the cold air. One more person, moving through a city of people, moving between their lives. Not remarkable from the outside. Meant to be. Platform. He stood and watched the lights of the train appear down the track, the specific movement of something coming toward you that you've been waiting for. He got on when it arrived. Found a seat near the window. Sat down. The train moved. The city moved past, the glass, the lit windows and dark streets, and the lake in the distance doing what the lake did in December, which was be enormous and cold and completely indifferent to the personal histories of the people visible from its shore. His phone rang. The ringtone he'd set for Lila, a short fragment of a song she'd chosen herself and that he'd long since stopped finding embarrassing. He answered. "Hey, Bug, are you on the train?" she said. He could hear the television in the background, which meant she was on the couch in the state she described as horizontal relaxing. "I'm on the train. I made hot chocolate," she said. "I made the powder kind, but I added the extra mini marshmallows." "The important ingredient," he said. "Exactly. How long?" He looked out the window, tracking the stops in his mind. "Okay," she said. "I'll save you some." A pause. "Or I'll try. Do your best," he said. She hung up, the phone in his pocket, and leaned against the window, watching the city, yes, and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he'd gotten better at. Emptiness, fullness, actually, the kind of full that doesn't need to be examined or narrated or resolved into something legible. He'd done the work. He'd made the decisions. He'd sat with the consequences of both them, the decisions that were made for him and the ones he'd made for himself. And he was, at this moment, on a train going home to his daughter and a cup of hot chocolate that would probably be mostly gone by the time he arrived. It was not a dramatic ending. Real endings almost never were. The dramatic part had happened in conference rooms and parking garages and restaurant booths, and a Thursday morning at a compensation meeting where a piece of paper had crossed a table and told him something he'd needed to know. The ending was just this: a man going home, a daughter waiting, a city moving past the window, the work done for the day, and waiting to be done again tomorrow. Brielle Langston would continue to run Sterling Crest under structures she should have built years ago, learning the things that needed learning, becoming either a better version of herself or not, on her own time and her own terms. That story was hers. Marcus would still be rotating his 3 ties and appearing at the edges of situations with impeccable timing, and Damon hoped his situation at Sterling Crest improved, because Marcus was decent, and decent people deserved better than the places that kept them. Carradine Holt would continue growing in the direction it was growing, and Damon's name would be on more doors before it was all finished. The work would require more of him as it expanded, and he would find a way to give what was required without giving what he'd spent 8 years, learning he was not obligated to sacrifice. And Lila would keep getting taller, which she was doing at a rate he found mildly alarming, and keep reading her horse books and making volcano kits and drawing signs on cereal boxes and telling him things about his own face that he needed to hear. She would, in a few years, start understanding more of the story he'd been living alongside her childhood. And when she did, he hoped she'd see in it what he'd come to believe was the actual lesson, not that the world rewards the deserving, because it didn't always, and he wasn't going to tell her it did, but that a person who knows their own value and refuses to negotiate it down to someone else's convenience is not being difficult. They are being honest, and honesty, sustained over time, the face of the specific pressure that life applies to make you give it up, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The train slowed for his stop. He stood, steadied himself against the motion, and moved toward the doors. They opened with the same quiet chime as every other set of elevator doors and train doors he'd moved through in his adult life. Different. Just an exit and an entrance, the way all thresholds were. He stepped out into the cold and walked toward home.